Are the Dallas Cowboys considering hitting the reset button for the 2025 season? All that and more in this episode of the Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That is $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Landon McCool. Follow him on Twitter at McCoolBCB. We'd like to welcome in all of our new listeners from the Locked On Mavs show who clearly don't want to watch or listen to their basketball team anymore. So let's talk about something more depressing, like the Cowboys considering hitting the reset button for the 2025 offseason. Later, let's talk about why might the Cowboys be considering a rebuild in 2025?
All the suffering, all the, look, I mean, why they would be reconsidering why they would be considering this is because, the Cowboys have consistently had a very good, but not great team. Right. And they've won 12 games, 3 years in a row. They've advanced to the playoffs each of those years. And each of those years, they've kind of run into a pretty severe disappointment in that playoff run, unable to get past the divisional round. And frankly, having not made a conference championship in, I've lost track now, 30 years. It's close, something like that. So I think, at a certain point, the Cowboys have, this last 30 years could easily be broken up into sections, right? Like the wasteland, which was, from like 1997 to
where I grew up watching football.
Yeah, basically
2003, right?
Yeah, I would say that the marking of the next era would be the ascension of Tony Romo, right? Mm-hmm. And then, then the Tony Romo era, and then, what was now the Dak Prescott era. Now let's be clear, like, obviously, the ascension of the Tony Romo era is a much happier spot to be if you're a Cowboys fan than the wasteland, the QB wasteland era of the Cowboys. But
when we were talking ourselves into Clint Sterner.
Well, I mean, listen, and we need to be clear-eyed about this. We're talking about heading right back out into the wasteland while we're doing this. So, but the truth of the matter is that there is a certain point in which you top out with this, right? Like you get a quarterback in here. You hope to get him on a rookie deal. The Cowboys got less of that because of the way that the quarterback situation played out, because you had some of Tony Romo's money on your cap. You bring in Dak, you kind of miss out a little bit on the rookie deal aspect of it. But you continue to try to do your best while you have a young rookie or cheap quarterback option. The Cowboys can't quite make it to the promised land. Then they have to start paying these quarterbacks, and that changes the angles as well, right? It becomes a little bit more difficult to assemble these teams. It becomes a little bit harder to kind of put up big time talent around. And through all this, the Cowboys kind of consistently were able to produce winning seasons, and when their quarterback was healthy, they were able to kind of consistently be in the conversation for contenders of in the NFC. But it never amounted to anything, right? It hasn't amounted to anything other than a lot of regular season success and then a lot of playoff disappointment. And that's not necessarily a commentary solely on Dak Prescott or solely on Tony Romo. But at a certain point, you've tried all the things that you can try. And you have to wonder if it isn't a time to kind of try something completely new. So that would be the argument for rebuilding, is that you feel like you've topped out this situation as best as you can, that it isn't going to get better than it has been, or you're not going to get the situations, especially that you had last year where everything kind of really was lined up for you.
Yep.
And you still weren't able to do it. So it may be time for a change.
Well,
is the argument there.
And this is where I come back to Jerry Jones's all-in statement. And I think everybody took all in as like, hey, we're pushing all of our assets in to win right now. I took it as, hey, this is our last dance here with this roster.
That's how he should have rephrased it, right?
It's
This
the
is our
last
last
dance.
ride, or
Yeah.
like the last chance. Yeah.
Yeah. And next year is going to be the year when the reckoning comes, right? And now I just want to be clear. I don't think, and we're going to talk about what a rebuild looks like. I don't think a rebuild for this team is everybody on our rosters for sale. It's a fire sale. Come get all our guys at 80 cents on the dollar, right? What I think it's mostly going to be is a year or two of trying to get the books in order, right? Like they have 3 big contracts that are going to have voidable numbers in 2025, including Dak Prescott, Zach Martin, and DeMarcus Lawrence. Now, there's a chance that all 3 of those players are either playing somewhere else or retired in 2025. And this is a way for them to like halt spending on outside free agents, which they've done this offseason, and maybe halt spending on players that they don't consider are non-all players. Because I think this still, under the rebuild, you still keep Micah Parsons and CeeDee Lamb, but maybe you don't keep the guys that are 29, 30 years old that you don't deem a core building block.
Yeah, and I mean, and let's be clear too. Like, we're calling this the rebuild, but honestly, I think we're going to talk about in the next section. This team is rebuilding in 2025. Like, whether or not we want to call it that or not, the sheer volume of unrestricted free agents that the Cowboys have going into the 2025 season means that there is going to be a massive amount of turnover on this team. Whether you want to call it a rebuild, whether you re-signed Dak Prescott or not. So I think the framing of it is going to be important. And it's not so much that the turnover is going to be the rebuild. It's what are the Cowboys doing with the money once they get that money back? That will kind of be dictating whether this is a reload situation where you're just trying to reload for all the free agents you lost, or truly trying to get your books in order, reset some things, and get prepped for a true ground up rebuild.
I also don't think it's a coincidence that they try to get as many compensatory picks for next year's draft as possible. I mean, they could have went out and signed a couple free agents, but they are set now to get 4 comp picks in next year's draft, which will give them 11 total picks. And you mentioned it, when we get into segment 2 and we look at the unrestricted free agents on this roster, they're going to need all those picks just to replenish the depth on this team. Go ahead.
I was going to say 11 picks total going into this class to refill the 2021 class that is about to expire out.
Exactly.
That had, if I'm not mistaken, 11 picks in that class. Yeah. So yeah, it's very much about kind of having a bunch of your players kind of all on expiring contracts at once, and then allowing the comp pick formula to help you replenish a lot of those guys that are walking out the door.
The other thing here is the Cowboys just really haven't had a rebuilding season in a long time. And that's not to say that they absolutely need one, but they've been operating on, they haven't gone all in one year, but they've been operating under this belief that, hey, we're going to stay competitive in this window. And that window has continued to stretch and stretch and stretch. And that's because the Cowboys have done a good job of drafting talent, signing players, filling roles. But there is going to be a time, maybe it's not next year, maybe it is, where they just need a year where they can get everything in order and then get ready for the next version of this team.
Yeah, there's only so far they can continue to stretch this window. And then at a certain point, you're not really increasing your Super Bowl odds, and you're creating a detriment for the opportunity of when you need to eventually do a rebuild anyway. So there should be a point where the Cowboys look at this situation and go, is it time to pull the Band-Aid on this situation? It's going to be painful, but it's going to be a lot better than dealing with it later.
All right, let's go ahead and look at the unrestricted free agents for the Dallas Cowboys set to hit the market in 2025, because there's a lot of them. We'll get to that next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Summertime means baseball, the NBA Finals, and so much more. And you can bet it all on FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 that you can use to bet on everything from the Finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park. Listen, Mavs fans, I know it's been rough the first 2 games, but the Mavs are still plus 660. to win the NBA championship on FanDuel. I thought those odds would be longer. Apparently, FanDuel believes that they still have a chance. I still think they have a chance now that that series is going back to Dallas. But I'll give you another bet that I like. Jaylen Brown to be the finals MVP. He's outplayed Jason Tatum in each of the first 2 games. He's plus 185 to win the finals MVP. If Boston goes on to win the series, I don't see how he's not the finals MVP. So go check out those odds as well. And visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and add a big win to your summer bucket list with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Are you having to turn down the volume because of all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, we are back here discussing the potential of a rebuild for the Dallas Cowboys in 2025. And Landon, let's look at the unrestricted free agents for the Cowboys because there's a lot of them.
Yeah, there is so many. I mean, again, we just talked about this, and here, if you're watching us on YouTube, you have it up here on your screen. Obviously, the 2021 class was a very big class, and all of those non-first rounders have expiring contracts. But just look at some of these names. I mean, obviously, Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb are names that we've been talking about a lot, but we haven't really discussed too much about the fact that DeMarcus Lawrence and Zach Martin have got expiring contracts this year. I think we've mentioned that Zach has got his situation because he just brought up that he may retire after the end of this year. DeMarcus Lawrence is a guy that really is at a crossroads, right? Like, I think it's going to be interesting. He's really kind of the bellwether of this whole situation, whether the Cowboys keep him and try another round of this next year or extend him, or what happens to him, I think is going to be really kind of a canary in the coal mine-ish, you know? Oso Odighizuwa is a name that is one of the most fascinating to me because he is the sole producer of pass rush on the interior. He's one of the better defensive tackles in the NFL at this point. And if the Cowboys are smart, even if they're doing a rebuild, I would consider at least thinking about kicking the tires to see what an Oso Odighizuwa contract extension would look like, because they've already struggled to get defensive tackles on this team. Jordan Lewis, Chauncey Goldson, Trey Lance, Cooper Rush, Eric Kendricks. These are all guys that are, important components of this team at certain spots. I will point out that, the Trey Lance, Cooper Rush, Dak Prescott, you have no quarterbacks on this roster for 2025. And that's really problematic for what you want to do. If the Cowboys are smart, I wouldn't be shocked if they gave Trey Lance a little of an extension, if he shows you just even anything in training camp.
I thought about the same thing because I had the exact same thought. Why would they give money to a quarterback that they don't know if the next head coach is going to want or not?
It's fair, but at the same time, it's like you're also already entering into a zero quarterback situation, which I think is worse to me. If you can find a way to get Trey Lance on a cheaper deal, like another prove it deal, even if it's just one more year, I think it at least gives you a quarterback who, maybe you can convince yourself you could get to a starting level. And that doesn't actually preclude you from going out and getting drafting a quarterback in the first round if you wanted. I just think
it wouldn't. But
I think otherwise you're looking at the reason I brought that up is because I actually looked at the free agent quarterback situation for 2025. And besides Dak Prescott, who's at the top of that list, there's a bunch of guys that, that the next coaching staff isn't going to like either. So I don't think it's the worst idea to have somebody on the roster that plays quarterback and has been in Dallas for a little while. But I understand. It's just seeing that list and seeing zero quarterbacks assigned for 2025. It's a little bit scary.
I should also mention this isn't the only list or only players that are set to become free agents. Even ones like Izzy Makamu. They just have a lot of depth players on this roster that are set to hit the market. Chuma Udoga, Peyton Hendershot. I mean, Rico Dowdle, Ezekiel Elliott. Now, a lot of those guys, I think you can call them replaceable, especially the running backs. But it's a sheer number of players here that it's kind of mind blowing. On this list that you see here right now, Landon, if I set the number of players re-signed at 2.5, would you go over or under?
I mean, realistically, I would go over because I think that they, we're having this conversation, but I don't know if they actually have the stomach for the rebuild that we're talking about. So I think that they end up signing at least, CD and Dak probably, and then I wouldn't be shocked if Jordan Lewis got a small extension, or Eric Kendricks did too. So
I'm going under.
If they're doing a rebuild, I would say 2 is the max. Yeah. But if they decide that they don't have the stomach for this, I mean, I would say at least 3 of these players are likely to be re-signed.
The reason why CeeDee Lamb doesn't really belong on this list is, first of all, the Cowboys can franchise tag him, which they certainly would if they got to that. I also just believe he's going to get a deal done within the next couple weeks or so. But he is going to be a potential solution out of the rebuild. Where I think a lot of these other players on this list are depreciating assets, right? Outside of maybe Oso Odighizuwa and Dak Prescott, right? But Dak is a totally different animal in itself. But like a Jordan Lewis, an Eric Kendricks, a Cooper Rush, like good players, but not players who are going to see an uptick in their value. So I think it's very likely that the Cowboys move on from 75 to 85% of these players next offseason. And they just know we're going to have the biggest turnover on our roster that we've had in the last 25 years.
Yeah, that's what I've been trying to say, is that I think that there is a huge roster turnover happening in 2025, regardless of whether they're rebuilding or not, simply because they can't afford to re-sign all these players. Especially, and that's the ironic thing, right? Especially if they sign the 2 guys at the top of that list, right? Yeah. If they re-sign Dak Prescott and they re-sign CeeDee Lamb, now they really can't afford to re-sign any of those guys. And that's when those comp picks become even more important. And that's why the comp pick situation, it isn't really a bellwether, right? Because you need those comp picks either way. Whether if you're rebuilding this team from the ground up, it's useful. If you're trying to reload with around Dak Prescott and his new contract and CeeDee Lamb, it's also useful because you need the cheap labor. So I think that either way, the Cowboys looked at this situation, saw how many players are on expiring contract, realized that it's unrealistic to try to replace all that talent simply through free agency and really just with a normal amount of draft picks. So they had to allow a couple players to walk without answer in order to gain the opportunity to not just replace those players, with players, but replace those players with cheap contracts and cheap labor because of all the room that's being taken up by the 3 guys at the top that are likely to get big deals.
All right, let's talk, Landon, about what the next head coach / quarterback combo could look like in 2025 and beyond. We will get to that next. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. Everydayers, on tomorrow's show, we're going to answer your Twitter questions, so make sure that you send them into us at McCoolBCB, at Marcus_Mosher. And a programming note, Landon and I are going down to probably 4-ish episodes a week. We'll not be doing 5 episodes every week for the throughout the summer, unless we get big breaking news like the Cowboys have signed a deal with Micah Parsons or Dak Prescott. Then
or anyone really,
anybody. Any outside free agent we're going to cover like it's the biggest news of the year. So just be aware of that. Let's talk about head coach quarterback combo because I feel 90% confident that the Cowboys are going to have a new head coach in 2025. I'm about 50% confident that they could have a new quarterback next year. What does that whole situation look like if the Cowboys do decide to rebuild?
Well, that's tough because it's so blue sky, right? I mean, part of me has been side-eyeing this Mike Zimmer hire for a while, right? Because it's like, what's really going on here? And so I'm hoping that this isn't like a priming for a Mike Zimmer, revenge tour as a head coach of some sort. I like Zim, and I think he's going to be a great defensive coordinator, but I'm really kind of done with retread head coaches at this point. I mean, look, obviously what McCarthy did here has been very great. It's been great. I mean, well, I guess has been good, not great, right? Like, I mean, as we said, he's put 12 win seasons each of the last 3 years. And honestly, it's hard to put, if we're looking to assign blame, I think with what is going on in kind of the playoff loss situation, of all the kind of people that have their hands in this the most, just by proxy of their positions on the team, I tend to think that McCarthy's the guy that has the least to do with what's happening in the playoffs. I could be wrong, but to me, he's set up this team in pretty good situation each of the last 3 years. They got into those games relatively healthy. One of those situations, they were the 2 seed, and had a home field game. I think maybe there's some aspects to be added that the teams weren't ready to play, or maybe you can make that argument. But I felt like for the most part they've done a good coach. So this is all a long-winded way of saying I wonder if the next head coach will continue to be a retread. Because it's hard to look at the situation and say McCarthy kind of failed. I think he did a decent enough job. It just wasn't good enough, right? So I guess what I'm wondering is, do the Joneses kind of look at the situation and go, who's another retread head coach we can bring in here that's experienced, that could kind of hit the ground running a little bit? Or do the Cowboys truly go into a kind of rebuild mode and go and get a Bobby Slonik or one of these one of these guys that is
Ben Johnson, right?
Ben Johnson from Detroit is another one that we've been hearing a lot. Who Johnson, actually kind of deferred on this year's round of head coaching interviews because I don't think he was into some of the options that were available, which I think opened up a lot of speculation that he may be interested in the Cowboys job if it becomes available. So I think that there are going to be lots of opportunities for the Cowboys in head coaching, especially if it's pretty clear at the end of the year that it's not going to work out. I think the Cowboys are going to get a lot of interested parties to come and be a part of a rebuild if that's what's happening here in Dallas, because I think that is a little bit more appetizing than kind of trying to cobble together, asking a head coach to do what Mike McCarthy was asked to do, which is get in here, continue to keep winning, and maybe just take it to another level without having to shake it up too much. That's a tough ask for any coach, especially a head coach who doesn't have experience.
Yeah, because I think if they're trying to retool, maybe let's say they go 12-5 again and they make it to the divisional round this year and they lose. That's what I think, like Bill Belichick and Mike Vrabel become options, right? If the Cowboys feel like, man, we're so close, let's bring in a new voice to help us get us over the hump. But I think if they're truly rebuilding, they're going to look at least I think they would be interested in a first-time head coach that they could develop, that they hope could be here for the long haul. And I was making the case to you before the show. I wonder if this would become a more attractive job across the NFL if it was clear the Cowboys are in a rebuild. Now, I know like Ben Johnson and Bobby Slowick might not take this job if Dak Prescott isn't signed on, because it's really hard to go to a team that doesn't have a quarterback. But I also could see it being attractive in the sense of, hey, Dallas is a good place to work, no income
fresh
tax,
Kansas,
right? Yeah, fresh and be like, okay, hey, now I know there's not this expectation that we have to win right away, because we are going to be ushering in a young quarterback, right, rookie quarterback, and we're going to have some time to build things the way that they should be built. I think the more interesting question here is the quarterback one. If you are rebuilding, you're probably not signing Dak Prescott to another long-term deal. Does that mean that you are drafting a quarterback? Or maybe the Cowboys feel like we need a year to reset our roster, and then we'll draft one in 2026 when we'll have a little bit more cap and a little bit more flexibility to build the right roster around them, much like the way that the Texans are doing it with CJ Stroud. That could get really ugly. Now we're talking about like a really rough season in 2025, but I think all of these possibilities are on the table.
I mean, I think you have to be prepared for that. Like, if you're truly, for the rebuild, I think you have to be prepared for a rough 2025 season and here's the other thing too. I don't know that the 2020, like next year's quarterback class is worthy of necessarily, putting all your picks into this year's
It doesn't
upcoming
seem
draft
like
class.
that right now. I mean,
So
unless you're a
yeah,
big Shedeur Sanders fan or Carson Beck fan.
yeah, I'm not. So, so I would say that you should like be a little judicious on how you want to handle it, which is why I guess again I'm a little bit nervous about the Cowboys not having any quarterback options, right? Like having a bad Trey Lance isn't a terrible thing, right? Like because you're not necessarily trying to win a bunch of games in 2025. Sure. So, but I think trying to go all in and get your quarterback when he's not worthy of it, that's worse. That's the worst thing you can do.
When am I allowed to mention the trio of Deion Sanders, Shedeur Sanders, and Mike Zimmer?
Let's do it now. We got 5 minutes left in the show. Let's get it out here and I'll yell at you and then we'll be done.
So I think Shedeur Sanders is a legitimate option if the Cowboys decide to move on from Dak, because I do think he has first round talent, right? And I think Mike Zimmer could be not a long-term option, but I think he could be the defensive coordinator with a younger head coach, maybe an inexperienced head coach. I just don't see the Deion thing happening. As much as I like to joke about it, and as much as Jerry loves Deion, and he would love the attention that Deion would bring on the Cowboys, even if the Cowboys are bad, because look at Colorado right now. I just don't see Deion taking that job.
Yeah, I mean, I think Deion would take the job. But I also, I worry about this legitimately because, as Jerry gets older, this could be a thing. And I am not a fan of it. I like Deion as a player, but, I have real problems with him as a head coach, and we don't need to get all into this because this is not a Colorado podcast. But, I just feel like that's not the right direction that this team needs to be going. This team needs to be going with a younger head coach that has new, fresh ideas, that's bringing kind of the stuff in. What Deion's doing at Colorado is mostly based on recruiting and name brand stuff, which is fine, which is, hey, it's working in some ways for them, but it doesn't really translate in the NFL, right? So I want a guy that's got some really innovative X's and O's stuff, that's doing things in a different way. We need to break through, and I think that breaking through requires changing it up and doing.
I think it requires them to go outside the box a little bit.
Yeah,
like stop with the names that they know, and maybe take a chance on somebody who has upside, but has not been part of the organization before. I mean, this is how some teams get really good hires, like Kyle Shanahan or Mike McDonald or however, like take a chance on something that could potentially help you take the next step rather than something that's just going to create newspaper headlines.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that's the step, right? Like otherwise you're just doing the same thing over and over again, right? I mean, it's otherwise just changing out the names and it's all the same. So I would, if the team is actually going to go through the rebuild situation, like truly lean into it and truly do something different and kind of go in a different direction. I just think that the death by 1,000 cuts of seeing the same thing over and over again is like, it's too much now. I would like to see something different. It's been 35 years now. So maybe change it up and try a different methodology. Let's see if that works.
All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen every single day. Again, on tomorrow's show, we're going to answer your Twitter questions. So make sure that you're downloading the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Go follow Landon on Twitter at McCoolBCB. I'm at Marcus_Mosier, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.